very much for the introduction. I'm going to play you a song. Hunters and collectors all come out at night. Hunters and collectors never see the light. Hunters and collectors all come out at night. Hunters and collectors never see the light. Midnight man. Hey. This is a song by the German krautrock band Can that you maybe know from 1969. It's not very well known, this single, but I found it just preparing this talk, and I thought it perfectly gives us a title for the following. As artists, we are whores at the gates of the palaces of the rich and ruling, said Raphael to Michelangelo when he was painting the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel in the 1965 film The Agony and the Ecstasy by director Carol Reed. The main actors were Charlton Heston and Rex Harrison. Very worth to see this film. The Agony and the Ecstasy. For my first trip to Northern America, I had to work some months to earn enough money. I just finished school and worked the early shift in a small factory in West Germany where I manufactured grinding discs on a highly dangerous assembly line. The job not only required very concentrated working, since you could easily lose a finger or more, but also a fast-working rhythm. There was no possibility for a break except the official times. There was a kind of relentless corporate spirit that kept me under complete control. In the breaks, the workers sat together, offering each other fruit from their own gardens or sausages to share. It was not easy for me to understand their interests because I had started to read the beat poets, mainly Burroughs, Ginsberg and Kerouac. I entered a different universe already. But I will never forget this time of hard work. This life experience coined my understanding of work and working class. And I took it with me on the road through the USA with my friends in a car from coast to coast in 2 months. From today's perspective, I realized that it was historically just the advent of postmodernism. In Germany, the old Fordist production system with the working class identity and all its implications was vanishing because, as you know, the 1980s were characterized by an international alliance of neoconservative forces, Reagan, Thatcher and Kohl. So why do I, as a visiting artist, mention all this? Because it was my first journey to the American continent, and now I'm here because I have been invited due to my artistic work. So traveling is part of my work. Thank you very much for the invitation. Now we'll start showing you my work I made in summer 2015. This was used for the poster also. It's a 4-part black and white, I call it landscape painting, as a photo text montage. Actually is inkjet print, each 65 by 43 centimeters. Last summer, actually I was working on a piece about my mother's trauma of her family's migration in the troubles and confusions of the Second World War as a child for a feminist exhibition in India. Then the so-called refugee crisis started, and I changed my focus to the actual situation. Since the early 1990s, I have applied the then new theories of post-colonialism and cultural studies on my own artistic work, which is, I understand it as a kind of critical reading of conceptualism, what I call de-conceptual, in a kind of deconstructive reading of conceptualism. That was at a time when most of the German art history hadn't heard as yet about the theory of representation regarding the triple oppression of race, class, and gender. I drew consequences for my artistic production and reproduction of pictures, which is documented in my works and theoretical essays since then. In this 4-part phototext montage, Welcoming Culture 2015, I relate updated images and rhetorics on refugees in Europe to the Blut und Boden, Nazi ideology of the own Scholle. Blut und Boden would be translated like blood and soil, and Scholle would be translated something like native soil under your feet. That was a standard ideological phrase in Nazi Germany. So I was asking myself, actually working on this history of my mother, how to use images of the recent developments and how to work with words. So I developed these 4 plates. I will show them in a row and then I'm going to read the text again. The first question was for me, what kind of images can be used? So I wanted to stage something which can be, through a longer history, can have a kind of symbolical meaning for people as refugees migrating under power. War traumatizes, forcing masses onto the Mediterranean. Image floods of refugee flows create waves of panic on the other side, in the face of the foreigners. Traveling on tired feet, marching along the Autobahn, refugees camping in train stations, smartphone in hand, as an apparatus of life. It transports images of their past, serves as orientation, and maintains contact with the family. Native soil is redefined Willkommenskultur as a political landscape painting. Talk is now of aid instead of blood and soil. And again, the relation of ground and inversion. If you have native soil under your feet, you defend it against foreigners. This creates new wars, new traumas and refugees. I tried to find a kind of abstract narrational level to talk about the actual things going on, but in the same time it should have been precisely related to the things which were going on continuously at that time. The German Chancellor, Angela Merkel, at this time gave out the slogan, "Wir schaffen das, we will make it." And this "we will make it" was a kind of motivation for thousands of people who gave their work, their motivation to help these people coming into Germany. And many other people on the way to Germany, because there's Austria and Hungary and Turkey and Greece and many other countries. And I would say in the first 2-3 months it was completely self-organized what happened there. Of course there were the officers, the police at the stations and the borderlines, but the people arrived in the cities and there was no organized infrastructure, of course. So many people voluntarily helped them and organized their life there. And this slogan by Angela Merkel, "We will make it," was a kind of very embracing gesture, opening the so-called nation for other people who come without rights, without papers, and they were welcomed in this country. But I must say that after, in the following months and in the year to this year's summer, Angela Merkel was under attack from many different directions. And this, she was always asked to take it back, to refuse, to say we cannot take any more people, things like that. What actually some more conservative countries in EU in the direction to the east already did. But Angela Merkel was defending her position, we will make it, and that I valued very high. You have to know, I don't know how much you followed this news, but in the last half year, the rate of migrants, of refugees coming into the center of Europe was going strongly down because the borders on the countries from the east were closed already. So in parts, the circumstances for these refugees and people coming there were really, really bad, unbelievable bad, because these countries wanted to give a sign to their origin that it's not worth to come, because the circumstances to live there are so bad that nobody else should come, and they wanted to push them back. So in Germany there was a real fight about this slogan, and I can tell you now that 3 weeks ago there was an election in northeastern country, Mecklenburg-Vorpommern. It's directly on the Polish border and the East Sea, and they voted more than 30% for a new reactionary party, which was built 2 years ago, 1.5 years ago. And I would say this party had only received only power through the development of this so-called refugee crisis. They had only one point, real programmatic point, and that was close the borders, throw all the people, the strangers out of the country. But you have to consider that this is a kind of absurd thing, that 30% of people in a country vote for this party, where in reality only less than 1% refugees were sent to this country. So what do we see out of that? We can see that elections and how the people perform elections is led very irrational. It's a very irrational form that these people vote against something what they doesn't attach in their real life. So then 2 weeks ago there was another election. Now it was Berlin. Berlin is not only a city in Germany and the construction of the state, it's also a country because it's a little bit bigger. We have some huge cities which are considered as countries. And in Berlin happened the same, that there was a tendency that the people walked away from the huge parties and gave a lot of votes to this new reactionary party, which is called AfD, Alternative for Germany. D is for Germany, Deutschland. And there again, the interesting thing is that not in the parts of Berlin where lots of refugees and migrants arrived and were in camps or in schools or whatever, but the people in parts of the city who felt underprivileged, they voted for this new party without understanding the context, I would say. So this, after all, after 1 year, Angela Merkel's slogan, "We will make it," pushed her so much under pressure that after all she now refused her own slogan, and now she said, Germany remains Germany, Deutschland bleibt Deutschland. And this is a very, very bad slogan because, like always, it was the same slogan translated to Great Britain as they voted some months ago for the Brexit. They said England will remain England, and it's very stupid because they received for 10-15 years millions and billions of money from the EU, but then just in a kind of effective reaction to things that I think they don't understand, and it's a problem to understand politics today because they are becoming more and more entangled and complex, and nobody wanted to moderate this to them, so they voted for the Brexit. It was very a little different, so only some percent, but like the development in Germany is showing that it's a real actual problem. And I understand my work, which I did last year, not this year, in this context, to find images and words that can criticize and in the same time provoke a kind of reflectiveness of this whole context. So today I want to talk about artistic archives, specifically on two archives I'm developing now. Before I start with this, I will tell some other things. The second archive is strongly related to this welcoming culture piece. Since Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari announced in their book A Thousand Plateaus, 1980, that one should develop divergent, deviant, or even dissenting archives of one's own, the contemporary digital possibilities are persuading. Tumblr, Flickr, Twitter, besides different websites, etc., are many tools to work with archives in a kind of public sense. But we have to discuss this later. But what can an artist achieve with her or his archive? What kind of public will be addressed, and does this project affect specific contemporary art institutional politics? These are the main questions concerning the presentation of two of my artistic archives. And one precondition of the whole question, how to work with your own work as an artist, is one term I'm working on since some years. I published one book, it's called Interesse, like interest, something like that. And I wrote another book which will come out in the end of the year on the same subject. And perhaps when I say Interesse, what is your Interesse or interest as an artist? You would say, what's that? It's not very substantial. What shall it mean? But if we go back a little bit in history, this term of interest or disinterest, the interesting or the not interesting, has provoked some discussions before. If you go a little bit further back in history, there was a French writer and thinker, Denis Diderot, and he decided in one of the first reflections on what art critique could be, that if a work is interesting, is one of the most important aspects when you enter an exhibition. And he developed 3 different levels of interestingness, which is, of course, one of the first points to say. And then the young romantics discussed this terms of Denis Diderot and positioned themselves in reflection in contrast to Immanuel Kant, who said this very, very important, gave this statement that art is not interesting. Art has no interest, because he wanted to separate art from the field of design, Gestaltung, and from nature. So he said, art is something different from that. And in his construction, art is always related to a kind of God-given originality. The original cannot, the artist as an original cannot explain how the idea for the artwork comes to him or her. That's his stance. That's Immanuel Kant, this famous German philosopher. And the young romantics, positioned with the reference to Diderot, themselves against Kant and said, no, we develop interests and we discuss our interests in long discussions. And as you maybe know, for the romantics, it was critic has the same value, the same potential like an artwork by itself. They said, if you make an artwork, it's a good thing, but you need critique. Without critique, an artwork doesn't exist. So they came to the point that art critique has the same value like an artwork. Critique is the most important thing. And then we have another guy in the last century, in the beginning of the last century. He's called Walter Benjamin, maybe you heard about him. And he was a great fan of the Romantics. He wrote one book that should be his PhD thesis, but he was explaining exactly these things. He was fascinated by these discussions of the young Romantics, but there was a problem. At that time, nobody wanted to accept his PhD thesis. So bad luck for him. But we continue in our our quick steps through history. There was an American artist, maybe you heard about him. His name was Donald Judd. And he wrote a very influential and very critical essay in 1965, which was called Specific Objects. And he was very, very strong criticized for this text, specifically from the side of the school of Clement Greenberg, who was one of the most important art critics and art theoretics in the middle of the 20th century. Because he moved in he was a minimal artist, and he moved the understanding of contemporary art far away from the rules Clement Greenberg was given. And I will read you just one sentence or 2-3 sentences of this text, Specific Objects, where the term interesting and interest plays the main role. This is 1965. A work needs only to be interesting. Most works finally have one quality. In earlier art, the complexity was displayed and built the quality. In recent painting, the complexity was in the format and the few main shapes which had been made according to various interests and problems. A painting by Newman is finally no simpler than one by Cézanne. In the three-dimensional work, the whole thing is made according to complex purposes, and these are not scattered but asserted by one form. It isn't necessary for a work to have a lot of things to look at, to compare, to analyze, one by one, to contemplate. The thing as a whole, its quality as a whole, is what is interesting. The main things are alone and are more intense, clear, and powerful. They are not diluted by an inherited format, variations of a form, mild contrasts, and connecting parts and areas. European art had to represent a space and its contents as well as have sufficient unity and aesthetic interest. Here you see that this term of interest in the 60s was a strong accent moving artistic practice away from this agenda which was built from Greenberg and his pupils. And I found it interesting that the so-called post-minimal and the conceptualism, post-minimal art and conceptual art, never had a kind of common medium nor a kind of common language. All the different members of this movement developed very, very different approaches. And this is what I consider as the specific point of conceptualism, that the ongoing discussion on what it is, what it should be, what it could be, what it can do, this is the interest of conceptualism and post-minimal art. And after a while, I was reflecting and asking myself, what would be one of the most important philosophical terms in the contemporary? I mean, this is more than 10 years ago that I started to reflect on that. And I found out there was a lot of discussions going on attention, attentiveness, for example, or collaboration, or what was the other one? Competence. These are all very valuable, very important terms. But I asked myself, for example, you learn a kind of, let's say, program on the computer, Photoshop, You're interested in working with photographs like this. You want to do it properly, so you learn Photoshop. But next time you're interested in video, so you learn, for example, Final Cut or something like that. And I'm convinced by myself, I didn't grow up with the computer, but since the early 90s, I was working with computers, writing and processing photographs, videos, etc. I realized by myself that when I stopped working with photographs for 1 year or 2 years, I just didn't compete with the development of the program, and I lost my ability to work with the photos. I really had to start again, and I was very slow to build the photos, to print them out and everything. I always had to ask other people how it's going, to proceed with this or that problem. And then I came to the point that the interest is the central thing. When I have an interest on an issue, for example, this with a welcoming culture, I learn the program to realize my work. And I keep in touch with the program, computer program, when I'm continuously work on some things with this medium. So I thought that maybe interest is more important than competence. And that was the point where I went deeper and deeper in this question of the interest. And as a de-conceptual artist, I'm interested in dispositive of research as a fundamental artistic practice of building. I read the word research in this specific sense the first time in a text by Frederick Jameson on Hans Hake's work at the end of the 1980s. I think it was Hans Hake's catalog, Unfinished Business, where Jameson was explicitly using this term of research. That doesn't mean research for research's sake in the sense of research art, which is very common since 10 years. But I mean research is as an epistemological process. It seems to function in relation to an issue, a theme, a subject matter, a genre, a medium, and a context like a genealogy or an institution, which all operate on a basis of subject-object dialectics. This diagram constitutes a dispositive in the sense of Michel Foucault, including his correct definition that the order of space and the order of language never coincide completely. This is actually the panoptical principle. And that is the reason why I insist on the condition of being in between, Interesse, interest, which I call the Interesse of the first order. With this specific kind of thinking, I try to give the term interest a second layer, or perhaps it would be more appropriate to say another dimension. What Gilles Deleuze would call eine Faltung, a folding, in the sense of Leibniz terminology. In modernist thinking, one would call this a kind of self-reflexive dimension, where the interest takes its own epistemology as subject for reflection. So you see this figure of I think and reflect myself thinking this, and then building a kind of endless chain. The term for this is Interesse, like interest, but the term reflection implies an understanding of the modernist self, which subsumes all objects under this hierarchical system as objects of reflection of the self. The model of the tableau, maybe you heard about this term, tableau, which is constituted by appropriation, classification, and taxonomy, is one of the core ideas of this. This model stems from the empiricists from the 19th century, which actually means, for example, not only in art, but also in art, but for example in biology, if you find an animal, you will take this animal, put it on the table, and then analyze how it looks like, then you compare it to other animals you found before, then you give him a name, and this is the process I described with the tableau. Just to repeat it, in modernist thinking, Interesse would be a self-reflective interest of second order, but in contemporary postmodernism, I call it just interesse as a de-conceptual diagram. This might be a little bit confusing, but now you're infected, and in the following time you will reflect on your own interesse if you want or not. I know that in Anglo-Saxon use, the word interesting means the opposite, that when you say, oh, do you want to see my work? Yes. Oh, it's pretty interesting. That means that it's not very interesting, but maybe we can have a kind of discussion about that. So now I will show you this, for example. I forgot to show you this. This was a gesture, a program. It started last fall, where it was stickers all over the cities, and the people wanted to show that there is a kind of interest getting refugees in the country and help them. Just to illustrate a little bit how important this term of interesse is, I show you two descriptions of artworks from the Museum of Contemporary Art I saw last week in Chicago. And if you, now you're, like I said, you're infected, you have the sensitivity to see this, you will see it in press releases, you will see it on wall text, you will see it nearly everywhere in texts on art. Here, Xaviera Simons is interested in creating images that require sustained viewing and so on. This is the first level of interest. For example, this is David Hammond's also. Where is it? There in the third line of the second text. These two Thai Buddhist bronze sculptures, British artist David Hammond travels to Asia with his personal interest in the history of African fetish objects known as etc., etc. So you will convince that. You will find it everywhere in texts on contemporary art. It's a kind of ideological basis for contemporary art. That's my thesis. And to continue now to the artistic archives, I would say, to put it very short, that the archive of artists is built out of their interest. And if the interest is more, let's say, popular culture oriented, let's say what I have on elements. Maybe you know this. This is Belgian artist Marcel Protas, who worked mainly in the end of the 60s and the 1970s. And he built this museum where over years he researched all imagery where you can see eagles in any forms. So he built a huge museum which was called Museum des Aigles, Museum of the Eagle. And he was bringing together everything from culture he could find with eagles. And if you see that even he got a painting which Gerhard Richter, the German painter, painted for him, an eagle. It's a small painting. I'm not sure. No, it's not here in this image, but on some images you can see it. And if you research what it means, this eagle, of course you have a kind of heraldic, symbolic meaning which goes back to the Middle Ages and maybe before that. But that the eagle has a specific meaning is a more or less definition by chance. And that is what Protas wanted to show, that the idea to bring elements together just in an iconic order is a more or less order by chance. But now we found another very important term which goes back to Michel Foucault, and that is the question of the order of the archive. Every archive has a kind of specific order. But to work with this, many artists collect every image that they found in any way interesting. So again, this term. So I will show you, of course, very bad images from the Atlas by Gerhard Richter, where he is collecting completely different things from newspapers, magazines, books, whatever, posters. He's taking photos by himself, and he brings them in a kind of order. And this huge order is containing many, 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 many books now from his long life. He's more than 80 years. And it's presented like that. I think this was an exhibition in Dresden, in the museum in Dresden, and he calls it Atlas. But I want to align this work by Gerhard Richter with an American artist you might know, and this artist also writes about this interest in collecting, and this is Richard Prince. I just found this book cover in the internet yesterday. It's called American English by Richard Prince, and it's a little book which is introduced by a text of Richard Prince, I think from 1984, which is called Bring It All Back Home. And have you ever heard of Richard Prince? You know, you're familiar with Richard Prince? The interesting thing with him is that his catalogs and books are full with images out of his private collection. And he's collecting records, he's collecting photographs, books, of course, but many, many different books. And he's not collecting books, he's also collecting different issues of one book. So he has, I don't know, it was something like 280 different versions of Lolita, Nabokov's Lolita, for example, and so on. He's also describing it as a kind of obsessiveness with collecting cultural items, American items. This title of his little text is going back to this very important, I think, 5th studio album by Bob Dylan, Bringing It All Back Home. This Bringing It All Back Home was published in Europe under a different title. I can't remember actually what it was. Oh yeah, it was Subterranean Homesick Blues. I never knew why he used two different titles. It was 1965. And I would say the order, it's very difficult. I wrote my PhD on Richard Prince under some others, and I think it's very difficult to say what is the specific interest of Richard Prince. But if we compare these two gestures of archives, Gerhard Richter gave his atlas to the museum to take care on his archive, and Richard Prince built his own museum upstate New York, where it has regular opening hours where you can visit his archive, his completely crazy collection of books and records and photographs, drawings, and so on. And then, of course, I don't want to leave him. This is a different form of archive by Walid Rath. He will come this week. I'm really looking forward to listen his talk. I really respect his work. I saw his performance at the last Documenta, and I was really, really impressed. I must say, I met him first time in the middle of the 90s, somewhere in Cologne in the Rhineland in Germany. But I really respect his form of building archives, and in the same time, how he performs his archives. He not only presents them to the public, he also, maybe performs in this context and gives it new layers of meaning, new layers of understanding these things. And with Walid Rath, I think also for me specifically interesting is that he requests the authority, how archives produce knowledge and how documents become valid documents of archives. So it's not only a question about iconography, like with Marcel Protas I was mentioning before, it's also a question about how history is written. And this is in a kind of performative ongoing process. So now I'm coming to one of my archives, and maybe you know that I did a long research on conceptual art, and this film that came out I called Conceptual Paradise, and there's a website I will show you now. There are two websites. The one website contains the basic information about the whole film. It's called conceptual-paradise.com. And if you go to film info, you will see this basic informations about the film. There's a description of the film. Then you can see where it was screened in the last 10 years. Then you will have some set photography, a little bit of different people and different settings where we made the film, the whole process of taking the interviews. I made 57 interviews in 4 years, and then we worked more than half a year on the montage of the film. And as you see, some of the persons who are here photographed are already dead, so this archive will have a kind of historical meaning. Then you are able to download this PDF. Can you see when I go with the cursor? Yeah. There's a PDF that you can download. It's a little, very little PDF. And then you can print out this little reader with an essay in English and German and all the information about the film. And what else? Yeah, that is the imprint. Just to show it, because when you build an archive in the internet, you need something like a responsible person or institution. In this sense, it's me. And okay, I'm going back to the start. When you conceptual-paradise.com call, there's the second possibility to go to this area, and this area is an archive I built through 2 years with my students at Leuphana University. Lüneburg is a little town 20 minutes from Hamburg. It's a campus town, like you say in Anglo-Saxon context. And we built, with different seminaries, we built this archive, and it's based on a Wikipedia structure. So it's free. You can download this structure. And the good thing is that I worked with the students and with my colleagues on it, and it was very easy to handle the elements of it. You have here the artists' interviews. You have here the curators and theorists' interviews. There's the introduction text, and there you have the tag cloud. And maybe you know that the size of the words depends on how often the term is used in the interviews. We received a prize for that 2010 as it was finished from the university, which made us very proud. But the bad thing, and this is to consider if you work with archives, after 1.5 years already the thing started to get broken. It didn't work anymore. For example, when you go to one of these names, which one do you want to see? Louis Kamnitzer, for example. Then you have a print version of the interview, and you have these different chapters. We did these chapters because at that time it was easier to do parts of the interviews because the loading process was faster. Today it's not like that. You can upload bigger files. So you could read the text here, and you could see the video here. Now it says missing plugin, but when you start to download the plugin, you will realize that it won't change it. Because the problem is, if you have a wiki structure like that, the wiki is called a data knob, and the data knot, and the data knot is open for all kinds of viruses. It's just sucking viruses from the whole net, and these viruses try to send emails from this wiki, and never do it. It's good to work, but after 1 semester or so, you should throw it away and transform it into a website, because all your work will be wasted. So all the work we did for this project is wasted, because, we have all the materials, the videos, the transcriptions, and all the other materials we have, but it's not working anymore. So I was searching for a different place to publish this, and I found the ZKM in Karlsruhe, which is a museum for media art and so on. And there we are just building a new structure, a new website, and it will look like this. Until now, we only have one interview because I was invited to a panel last week about art and language in Chicago, and we just uploaded the whole material on art and language. There you will read the interview and you can print it out. And here you can see the video documentation. Yes?
Is that a fuller version or is that a clip from the actual film?
No, this is the full version of the interview. So you can see all the 57 interviews in full length and read the transcriptions. Bloody hell of work. And I couldn't do it by myself. I have the support of the museum also. They have a web designer and an informatic engineer. And so now you have the categories here on this side where you can click on, and then you jump into the text where they use these words. And you will have additional material of them on this side. And here are the photographs I took during the interview processes. So that was in a backspace. This was the opening of the exhibition at Mikromuseum Zürich, 2004, I think. And here you see the two artists, Mel and Michael, and this is the director of the Kunsthalle. So this just as an example. Then you have this navigation possibilities about the whole website, but as I said, it's just only this interview until now. It will work like this. And to come back to this term of interest, my interest was, I had two interests as I started the project Conceptual Paradise. One project was to have this film, this documentary, this essay film. This is more or less a kind of pronunciation of my understanding of conceptualism, or I would say a kind of de-conceptual lecture of the interviews I made. So I'm in the film. You have the chance to see it because your department has a copy of it. My film is organized in chapters, and the chapters have kinds of issues like language in conceptual art, or performance in conceptual art, or post-colonialism in conceptual art, things like that. So you can jump on the DVD, you can jump from chapter to chapter. But in the chapter, you will have a concise discussion of different perspectives of this issue. And I, as a director, had the function, understood myself in the function to strengthen these argumentations between these artists and bring them in a kind of critical contrast to each other. I was very happy that nearly everybody who was involved in the project was happy with the outcome, with the film. But the film is actually nearly 2 hours, so it's quite a big piece. This is one interest. This was one interest. The other interest was from the beginning, and I told everybody that the interview will, in the end stadium, will be in a kind of bigger archive where I collect all the interviews, and everybody can develop its own lecture, its own reading through this whole material. So this was my interest 2002 as I started this project. And this is what I call the importance of deconceptualizing your archive. Because if you start with an archive as an artist, you will have a kind of idea what it can be. But in the same time, when you read and when you work with the materials, you will find elements which are not appropriate, so you throw them out. Or you will meet people which you don't like, so you will throw them out. Or they throw you out, things like that, of course. So it's an ongoing process. And this is one important thing to talk about archives. When we think of archives, most of the time we think of finished, ready, closed archives. These are these archives we mean when we think of old libraries or things like that. So if you take a book out, first you have to blow away the dust which settled in the last centuries on this book before you can open it without having a sneezing or something like that. But the interesting thing on archives is that they are always in a building process. Even if you have a huge archive that you try to defend against the tooth of time, then you have to renew things, you have to renovate things, you have to find new spaces, you have to renovate the spaces, you have a kind of administration. All these things are true if you have your own archive in the internet. I cannot tell you how many artists I know which built their own websites in the early 90s or in the late 90s, and these websites just don't function anymore because of changes of computers, of programs, of internet, or whatever. So the thing is, if you consider to build an archive, you always have not only to think what to put in it, it's also how you can maintain the whole thing. One of the key words of the contemporary is the maintenance of archives, of collections. This is also a reason in a different reading why many museums start to sell artworks. In earlier times, nobody sold artworks from museums. They always wanted to collect and to increase their collection. But now they start to sell artworks to buy others. And this is a critical neoliberal development. But it's a different thread of discussion. So, do you have any questions to this this already overworked and developed archive of conceptual art? Yes?
I find that often I'm talking about a collection and an archive at the same time. So how do you separate those?
I mean, by definition, an archive is something that can get used by an individual interpretation, interest, whatever. And a collection is something that, in my understanding, like a museum's collection, is something that gets presented to the public as in, for example, in the mode of exhibitions. We would say archive more to books-related collections and pure collections more in artwork-related collections. But I think if you go into the philosophical meaning of the terms, it's not so easy to divide between them. It's more a question of how the institution handles these things. And it's maybe you can relate it to the function. What is the function? I would say for me two terms the most important things in the archive. First the interest and the second the function. Other people would say that, for example, the digital structure and the status of the objects is more important. For me it's not so important what the status of the objects is, I would say. Maybe we keep this question in mind and come back to it in a discussion at the end, what the difference between archive and collection is.
I didn't actually think of something while you were talking. I think it's because of what you said, but I think that an archive would be the way you access the collection.
Mm-hmm.
So how you access it, and so what meaning, like an archive can set up a certain kind of set of meanings, can construct the meanings within the collection. So it's like a meta.
Mm-hmm.
We can talk about that.
Yeah, I would agree. From this point of view, I would agree. Other questions?
How do you see us on Thursday when we get together, working through some of these questions?
Yes?
I think we should shape that discussion.
Yeah, good. Good. How many time do we have now? How much?
Because we're pretty much 10 out.
Mm-hmm.
But do you want to show really quickly your other archive project about the refugee archive? I think that would be really good, but we have like the most, we have 10 minutes left.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Then maybe we can talk after Thursday.
Actually, for the second project I want to present, I don't have specific images. I would go back to this one because it's about a documents archive for refugees, photographs, drawings, writings, music, whatever. And I started the idea to this project during I worked at this work last summer, or summer last year. And I realized that the possibilities with the new media and the handheld devices, all these people, most of these people were traveling with mobile phones, and they were continuously sending with their cell phones images, little videos, written messages, and so on, to their families, or were uploading them to different websites like Facebook, Twitter, and so on. So I think with this so-called refugee crisis, a complete new form of media communication started last year, which was not so present before. And if we consider that the UNO now speaks about 50 million people on the move, globally considered, and maybe a big part of them, maybe the half or more than half, use mobile devices to store or send their materials to the internet, to their families and so on, then we convince a complete new understanding what it means that the people are moving on the move, but in the same time they document their move. This has different aspects. One aspect would be, of course, that the family knows where these people are. But as we know now, the security service of Syria, for example, they research the documents and the internet to find out who is saying what about the Syrian state, and they try to catch people who are related to this people on the move. So if you want to build an archive for this, you have to rethink some things which were not relevant for earlier digital archives. And this was my constantly thinking, and I participated in some conferences and discussions in the last year. And to make it short now, we don't have a kind of concrete archive, but with the artist Dorothee Albrecht and the art historian Annette Mechtel, we want to start a discussion about how a kind of archive for this refugee documents could be developed. And one aspect I have to mention before I end is that just talking and pronouncing this archive, there was a big resonance, especially from the side of corporate interests, because they thought to support something like that would be good for their corporation. But we were not interested in all the questions they had. We didn't want to make an exhibition of that. We didn't want to give links to their corporate websites. All this were things we said, this is complete secondary. We don't want to talk about that. What we need are completely different things. And these criteria to build something like this archive and how all the different people can participate in the ongoing process, building this archive, that is the main point, and that is maybe now taking a little bit too much time to list it up. I can, if you want, I can read this on Thursday when we have the workshop. Thank you very much.